Support for This News is So Gay comes from the LGBTQ Opportunity Fund of the Cleveland Foundation, leveraging philanthropy to empower LGBTQ communities. Welcome to This News is So Gay. I'm your host, Ken Schneck, editor of the Buckeye Flame, Ohio's LGBTQ newsroom. Thanks so much for joining us. An op-ed from a conservative white gay commentator has stirred up some reactions. What is the fuss all about? The Trump administration's LGBTQ related cuts just keep coming. What's the latest and how might it affect you? California Governor Gavin Newsom continues his far right-wing media tour. What problematic thing has he said now? And queer joy. Why is it important and where are we finding it lately? Joining us this week to talk about all of those stories and so many more are the co-founder and staff writer at the Athens County Independent, Dani Kington. Hello, Dani.
Hi, Ken. Thanks so much for having me.
Great to have you here. Editor-in-chief of The Advocate, Alex Cooper. Alex, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And founder and executive editor of the Los Angeles Center for Investigative Journalism, Serna Jr. Albert, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, Ken, thanks for having me.
Well, our LGBTQ Reporters Roundtable is now assembled, so let's dive in. A few weeks back, conservative gay political commentator Andrew Sullivan penned an op-ed for the New York Times entitled "How the Gay Rights Movement Radicalized and Lost Its Way," and it certainly got people talking. I will be very upfront and say that I debated in my head endlessly in putting together this week's show. First, whether I wanted to include this at all, and then when I decided I did. Second, do I really want to put it at the top of the show? But I kind of do. And I am right now, because I think it actually encapsulates so many of the conversations that are taking place right now. But before we even dive into the reactions, Alex Cooper, can you tell our listeners the point that Sullivan was even trying to make?
So Sullivan was essentially saying how the LGBTQ rights movement, essentially after marriage equality, there's been some confusion in the movement, and in his opinion, what is happening when it comes to queer rights is too far, and it's too far for people, and it's too far for society, essentially.
And it certainly, as I said, got people talking. By the way, I was going to bring in a little bell, and I was going to ring it every time one of us rolled our eyes. And I know this is audio, everyone, but know that the bell would have gone off a few times already. But the op-ed got people talking. Alex, I know you all at The Advocate published some of those reactions. Talk about how people are responding to this op-ed.
One person, Marcia Bianco, she wrote for The Advocate, just essentially saying how Sullivan's argument is... it's just very assimilationist, and it's very anti-trans. She says that, he's safe because of marriage equality and these other things, but that other people are not. People who are not cisgender, people who are not in the same economic situation that he is. So when, in the article, he says, essentially, that the queer rights movement won after marriage equality, her argument is, no, this is not true. It's not true at all.
I remember in 2015 writing a piece I was writing for the Huffington Post at the time, and there were so many organizations saying, we have won the ultimate victory. We've won the ultimate victory. And I remember writing a piece saying, stop saying that. That's not actually true. There's so much other inequality out there. Albert, I know that you definitely had a reaction to Sullivan's piece, in particular on X, calling it, quote, complete and utter hogwash. And for our listeners, we need to all start using the word hogwash more than we are currently using it. Say more on what you posted on social media, Albert.
Yeah, I think when I read the article, first of all, it was kind of a shock to me in as a journalist, right, as a queer person, especially as a queer person of color, that this ideology is still lingering around. But I'm not surprised. We see it all the time. I would consider Sullivan to be a TERF, truly, in the context of wanting to assume that we have, quote unquote, won. And the only thing we've really won in this case is the ability to marry like every other straight person in the country. He makes these claims that we've become radicalized, but fails to really look at the context of how we got here, right? When we look at the historical movements that have led us to this point to get marriage equality, to, prevent teachers from being discriminated, it was all considered radical at the time. And people like Sullivan would have balked and said, oh no, we're going too far. He talks about this new radical gender revolution when really what we're doing, or what the community is doing, is acknowledging that trans and non-binary folks are part of our community, have been since the beginning, are at the leaders of it. And he wants to talk about gender affirming care for kids, but really doesn't get the nuance of what that actually is and what it looks like, right? We know that sometimes it's just simple as hormone blockers, or allowing students or children to dress in the gender that they identify with. He's assuming and mirroring talking points from conservative leaders that we're giving life-changing surgeries, when it's really not that serious. It's not that same mentality. A student of 12 or 13 put on puberty blockers is not going to be getting the same type of medical treatment that somebody who is in their 20s experiencing. He's not acknowledging that there's levels to that care. So it's ridiculous and silly in my mind. Like Alex said, he's operating from a place of privilege, from a white cis gay man, and doesn't take into care, or doesn't bother to mention the complexities that exist within our community.
I think there was a line in the piece that said, I might just be a white, privileged old fart. And to which Albert Serna Jr. said, yes, you are correct right there in what you said. Sullivan's piece ended, though, with this sentence. He wrote, quote, but in America, on this anniversary of the Obergefell decision, we also need to remember a critical thing: we won. And again, I immediately thought, it doesn't feel like the LGBTQ plus community is winning, certainly not here in Ohio, Dani. From your vantage point in rural Ohio, how do we take in words from these coastal, privileged, older, white, cisgender, gay, I said men, but I could have said old farts, just to use his words, telling us that the LGBTQ plus community has won? How do you digest those words from the work that we're doing here in Ohio, and in particular you in rural Ohio?
Well, first of all, I guess just to build a little bit on what Albert was saying, the first thing that really jumps out to me is that we won, which neglects the fact that so much of the history of the LGBTQ rights movement has been contested. There hasn't been like one single goal that everyone was working towards, which marriage equality is often framed as having been. But thinking more about this local context, I mean, it just seems so utterly divorced from reality. First of all, just like as a trans woman, I have felt the impact of what's been happening around us, in this past year. It's been palpable, the uptick in harassment that goes on in this community, but also, I'm sure, everywhere for trans folks across the country. Much of that comes from the federal level, of course, and is true in rural Ohio as much as it is in urban centers in blue states. But, Medicaid cuts are causing folks to fear for their access to medical care across the country. Thinking in Ohio specifically, the attacks on LGBTQ children in particular have been just really pronounced. And this piece sort of talks about the impact on children as if it's negligible, or the impact on trans children anyway. When we know that suicide rates are high for trans youth, and we know that laws regarding medical care and things like sports, which the writer targets in his piece, are part of affecting children's safety and well-being. In Ohio, where we have had a ban on trans youth competing in sports and a ban on trans youth accessing medical care, local providers have told us that those things have destabilized the queer youth that they work with. Our local superintendent has said that they have had trans youth participate on the sports teams in the Athens schools, and that's always been fine and never had an issue. And, when we think about sports for trans youth, like that is just one more protective factor, that access to community, play, and so on, that's being taken away. And, I personally know families who have had to move out of state to ensure that the children in those families can continue accessing medical care. So, it just seems like so disconnected from the truth of what's going on across the country, but also in the communities and in the particular places that this writer does not seem to have very much of a understanding of or connection to.
So what I hear you saying, Dani, is no more coastal gays having opinions. I think that's the message here. So it's just going to be the Dani and Ken show from here on out after this week. We'll finish this one. And by the way, we're not even going to get into the New York Times platforming such yeah, and folks can't see, but their arms
Why?
being thrown in the air right now. We're going to have to, and you folks can't also see Gray, our producer, but Gray, note we need to have more sound effects for eye rolling and people throwing their hands in the air. So a lot more to talk about there, but we got to move on to some other stories. The reverberations of the Trump administration's cuts to basically anything LGBTQ plus or LGBTQ plus supportive continue to be felt across society. The LGBTQ plus specific support option for the 988 suicide prevention and crisis intervention hotline has now ended, and you definitely want to check out last week's episode for our conversation about that. But let's talk about some other cuts. Although before we do, I should say, Albert, we should highlight that states like California, they've come up with a 988 workaround.
When folks were in crisis and it was specifically dealing with LGBTQ identity issues or things that would fall into that realm, folks could press what was called option 3 to be connected with somebody who was a specialist in LGBTQ crisis and health and mental health. That's basically the cut that happened in California. The workaround was essentially to partner with other organizations like the Trevor Project, who will train crisis counselors in California to specifically meet the needs of LGBTQ folks. So rather than having to press option 3, which no longer exists, the counselor on the other end is meant to already be trained in these issues. And I believe there's about 12 centers in California that have 24/7 operators that can work with people. So this is all done to make sure that folks who are in the state can reach the help that they need. I'd really like to note that, generally it's youth that are calling these crisis lines, right? In California, when youth report to their counselors at school that they're having these kinds of issues or might have these tendencies, there's procedures that follow, but they are directed to these helplines. So California has been seen as this kind of holdout against the Trump administration and the pushback against LGBTQ rights and equity. So it's this one step, and hopefully it works. I mean, I have a lot of high hopes, but there's a lot of groundwork already that exists through various LGBT centers to support, and they're all kind of getting involved to support the Trevor Project and this, 988 number.
So some support there, but some organizations getting hit so hard. Alex, tell us about Rainbow Labs. That was a wonderful piece that you wrote there.
Yeah, so Rainbow Labs, it's an LA-based group, and last April, or this past April, the group received an email from the government saying that its AmeriCorps grant had been rescinded. And AmeriCorps provides funding to a lot of nonprofits for programs, initiatives. Nonprofits can use the grants to support personnel even. And so it was part of $400 million in funding that was cut by the Trump administration. And Rainbow Labs works to connect queer youth in the LA area with mentors, queer mentors specifically, so that youth can draw inspiration and support from these adults and the adults' lived experiences. So the grant was a part of a 3-year grant that was supposed to run out in 2026. The organization lost over $150,000 in funding, and so they sued. They were part of some other nonprofits who sued the government to try to stop this cut, who they told the advocate, was detrimental to their programs and their initiatives. And on the good news, though, that on July 7th, actually, a judge granted a preliminary injunction stopping the cuts for being implemented for now.
Okay, so a little bit of hope there too.
Some hope.
Dani, no pressure to end on hope on this one, but here in Ohio, Planned Parenthood made some announcements which they called heartbreaking. What's going on with Planned Parenthood in Ohio?
Well, so essentially, due to state and federal funding changes, including a federal provision that has targeted Planned Parenthood to try to prevent them from accepting Medicaid, 2 Planned Parenthood clinics in its Southwest Ohio region will close. Those are in Springfield and Hamilton. One important caveat I just want to add right at the beginning of talking about this is that Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio is still accepting Medicaid due to an injunction in the courts against the particular change that would bar Planned Parenthood from accepting using Medicaid. But regardless, other changes such as work requirements for Medicaid are going to severely hamper the funding that Planned Parenthood relies upon. So according to a story in Ohio Capitol Journal, the 2 clinics that are being closed were chosen based on their volume of Medicaid patients regularly treated there, which, tells us that the folks losing access to this care are the folks who are in poorer communities that are most reliant on programs like this. The anti-abortion crowd has reacted to this news rather gleefully, but of course, by removing access to birth control and other reproductive health care, that is just going to increase the number of abortions in the state, which people really neglect to consider the full range of services that organizations like Planned Parenthood provide. And of course, I fully support people being able to access abortions when they need them, but people being able to access birth control treatment is also essential. So yeah, it's really a horrible thing for rural communities in the state. Clinics will still be open in Dayton and Cincinnati, but it does make me nervous for, as the funding cuts continue to progress, what will happen to rural healthcare. And I'm thinking especially about, the trans and queer folks who use Planned Parenthood services locally, who kind of can know that Planned Parenthood is a safe place to access that medical care, whereas other healthcare providers, folks might not have the same baseline trust in, and that might prevent folks from accessing care. So, I will struggle to end this one on a note of hope.
I will amp it up, though, and make it even worse, right? So here in Ohio, we have the Medical Conscience Act, which allows healthcare providers to deny care to anyone based on their moral, ethical, or religious beliefs. And so I think that folks don't really understand always that Planned Parenthoods really are a central nexus for LGBTQ individuals, especially in rural areas, to access healthcare, especially when they know that they might not be able to go to another provider because they could just be refused care for being LGBTQ plus. So however lacking in hope you made that end, Dani, I made it worse. So teamwork on that one. Let's keep going with this. One of the topics that we did cover last week, more changes. This was specifically around the changes to LGBTQ plus support on college campuses. And holy crud, did folks reach out to us saying, we want to hear more about that topic. I think because I'm in the higher ed world, and so had some people in my orbit saying we wanted to hear more. So let's talk a little bit more about that landscape. Dani, talk about what's going on in Southeast Ohio and LGBTQ plus college student support.
Sure. Earlier this year, the Ohio legislature, which is, overwhelmingly controlled by Republicans, passed a bill that they have called the Advance Ohio Higher Education Act, which has overhauled much of Ohio's education system in a more conservative direction. One of the biggest impacts of that law is that it bans DEI initiatives at Ohio's public colleges and universities. Different institutions have implemented this differently, but one thing that has seemed to be true at universities across the board is the closure of diversity centers. And at Ohio University, which is in Athens, where I live, OU has closed its Pride Center and other DEI-based programs, including the Multicultural Center and the Women's Center, as of June. The web pages for those programs were taken down, and basically this eliminates key safe spaces for queer students, women, BIPOC students, many of whom, of course, find community in all 3 of these places. And this is not just a safe place that students can be, it's a place that folks can make connections, develop a real community of support, and access needed resources and material support that the university is taking away. There were staff dedicated to, supporting these students that are no longer in those positions. Luckily, the local community here has stepped up. The Athens County Foundation launched the Athens County Pride Fund in response to all of this, which is aimed at providing eligible nonprofits and public entities that serve the LGBTQ community with support. And United Campus Ministry, which is a local nonprofit here, has also risen to the challenge, offering many of the resources that the Pride Center used to offer, like books, gathering space, and so on. So there's a little glimmer of hope in the community support for sure. But the impact on marginalized students is really disappointing, to say the least.
Yeah. And over in California, Albert, I know there are a lot of fears in California, in particular at some community colleges, about the Trump administration's proposed cuts. Talk to us about how folks are reacting out there.
Yeah, and I have to be a little cautious because I'm also in higher ed, but at the community college level. So I'm going to speak a little more generally. But one thing is the concern, as Dani mentioned, for these diversity centers, specifically LGBTQ centers in community colleges and junior colleges, where, they provide resources for students who, need help finding different levels of care, therapy, or just community, right? And so these grants or these funding that exists right now gets trickled down to these centers through the college. But the fears are that because they are in that quote unquote DEI sphere, they're going to get cut. So what folks are basically doing is trying to run out the money before it can be taken away. In certain places, internal memos are going out saying, hey, we support you, reminding that these centers, these faculty, people who run these LGBTQ centers or rainbow groups or lavender graduations, what have you, that the support is there. But, the real fear is that if the Trump administration gets its way, that money is going to kind of be taken out. So trying to do the best they can with their students and making sure that the resources are in place, that money is used, that they're creating their lavender graduations, that they're setting up resources, that they're buying the equipment that they need or buying the supplies that they need to support students, is really what's happening here in California. And the interesting thing, right, is that California is this kind of bubble, and it's the outlier, I guess, or the more outspoken blue bubble, so to speak, that's kind of combating all of these changes. And so really, I think pretty soon we're going to see that trickle down a little more heavily as the Trump administration starts to put its eye on more diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And so this is kind of where that tension is and what the fears are. And so folks are just kind of preparing for the worst and doing all they can to really secure themselves and create a little insulation while they have the chance.
And by the way, that's Albert Serna Jr. reminding me I probably should be more cautious in what I'm saying, as I am still a tenured full professor of education at Baldwin Wallace University, but only for 10 more days. And then I will be more unfiltered, as if that's possible. Alex, I saw a piece in The Advocate that certainly made my eyes pop a bit about student loans, which are obviously pretty higher ed related. There are some concerns about how student loan forgiveness is going to be affected for LGBTQ plus folks.
So Trump signed an executive order in March that changes the public service loan forgiveness program, which allowed graduates who had taken out student loans to do public service, work for a nonprofit, state government, things like that, to work a certain amount of time, and then their loans will be forgiven. And the Trump administration has essentially made it that for those who have worked in, say, a nonprofit that supported trans rights, that would not be eligible for this forgiveness. And so that's drastically going to affect, nonprofit work, people who are deciding to go into nonprofits, especially queer rights and these organizations that rely on this talent, and for the talent who are relying on this program and programs like this to get their loans forgiven, depending on how much they loan out.
As the executive director of an LGBTQ plus nonprofit, yeah, this would be a little bit concerning. Thank you for covering that, Alex. Again, folks, you are listening to This News is So Gay. I'm your host, Ken Schneck from the Buckeye Flame. I'm joined this week with Dani Kington from the Athens County Independent, Alex Cooper from The Advocate, and Albert Serna Jr. from the Los Angeles Center for Investigative Journalism. Let's stick with that California vibe. California Governor Gavin Newsom appeared on another right-wing podcast, certainly fueling a lot of speculation that he will be running for president at some point. And he is again causing LGBTQ plus controversy. Albert, this is your governor. What did he do now?
Oh, man. Well, as you mentioned, Governor Newsom appears to be, or there's speculation around him trying to make a bid for president. So I think in that sense, he's trying to appeal to a more center base. As we know, or as some people recall, Gavin Newsom was the mayor of San Francisco who started providing marriage licenses to folks in the city, which kind of led to the whole movement in California to legalize same-sex marriage. He basically went on a right-wing talk show and started entertaining these right-wing talking points about, trans care for minors and, trans athletes. And although he didn't explicitly say, support these things, he kind of lent credence to them in a way that was both disconcerting and, just concerning overall. It appears that he's trying to take a page from former Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg's playbook by joining in on these conversations. We know that Pete Buttigieg went on Fox and has done all these conservative podcasts, but I think where the real difference is that Gavin Newsom seems to be trying harder to appeal to a conservative, straight, white male base, and he's providing space for these platforms. A lot of people were really upset when he joined the Sean Ryan show, which is, again, a conservative outlet. He didn't really support some of these issues, but when they brought up this whole issue, or the non-existent issue of children going and using a litter box, he didn't deny it and discredit it. He was like, oh, I've heard of things like that. And it's, first of all, not true. So he's putting his foot in his mouth. And I think what's more concerning is that he's starting to lean in a way that is isolating the supporters that he built up when he was the mayor of San Francisco, and in all the things that he's doing right now in California to kind of combat the Trump administration's attack on LGBTQ folks, or, implementing policies that support queer people. He's kind of backhandedly doing something against the community. So yeah, Mr. Newsom.
I know, kind of expecting him to just make the announcement that his vice presidential pick is going to be Andrew Sullivan. So we'll keep our eyes open for that. But Alex, I know that at least one ally, and not unlikely, but that was unexpected ally, is speaking out.
I was surprised.
Go for it.
Jeopardy champion and host Ken Jennings took to Blue Sky to call out Newsom. Journalist Parker Malloy, she posted that she would never, ever vote for Newsom. And Jennings shared her post and, said, quote, "This is correct. Any candidate cynically triangulating on trans kids is a non-starter, and now is the time to say so. There's still so much time to advance candidates that don't suck," end quote. So yeah, Ken Jennings.
We'll take it.
Bravo.
We'll take it. We find queer joy, a lot of people do, in Jeopardy, so I am okay with that, and especially Ohio's own Amy Schneider, who will always get a shout out in my book. But let's talk about queer joy. One LGBTQ plus journalist recently wrote about the importance of balancing action with queer joy, and that journalist, well, that was Alex Cooper, editor-in-chief of The Advocate, who's with us right this second. Alex, first, before we talk about queer joy, what inspired you to write those words?
We need it. Gosh, it's a lot right now as journalists working in these spheres to just being queer people. I think the idea of joy is something that we tend to not think that not that we don't deserve it, but that it's not important. Like, we need to focus on other things first. Like, we'll be happy after the fight is won, essentially, right? Like, when our rights are won, then we can be happy. Well, I forget exactly, and I know I heard this somewhere else, and this was what inspired this piece and me thinking about queer joy so much, is that, joy is an action. Like, you can be joyful and, like, there's still resistance in joy, and you can be happy and do things that are joyful and still be putting up the fight. And I think talking about, having queer joy and then also doing it as an action too, I think it's a pretty bold statement to oppression of being like, even under the limitations or restrictions placed on someone, then they're still finding opportunities to thrive and shine.
I love that. In what might become a regular segment on This News is So Gay, depending on how this goes, would love to get some queer joy stories from you all that you saw out there in the news and why you are shouting them out to us real fast. Dani Kington, any queer joy stories that caught your attention?
Yeah, I'm thinking just, hyper locally, there has been a group of trans people in Athens County called Trans Peer Support Athens that has sprung up over the past year. That's, appeared in a couple of local news stories, mainly in the student publications. But yeah, they have been hosting these monthly parties called Shotlucks, where they're potlucks, where people come and take their hormones together. And just at the last one earlier this month, I was sitting around a living room and there was probably like 40 people there and a dozen of us like all taking our hormones together in the living room. And it was just this very lovely little moment of queer joy. And I think that, this is something that really arose in response to all the horrors that our community has been experiencing. But also, I feel like these monthly events have brought so many people together in a way that we weren't connected before. for. And so I think that community building and queer joy can also be resistance, and not just a respite from it.
Hashtag shotlux. I will never be able to unhear that. I love it. Albert, any stories of queer joy that came across your radar?
I'm very into art and photography and queer history, and so one thing that there's a local museum, the Getty. I don't know if you heard of it, but so the Getty is putting on an exhibit about the queer lens, and it's looking at the history of queer photography and images, and it's really amazing, right? Because I think right now so many people feel that they are being erased in so many different ways. We're seeing cuts to public broadcasting, to media. We're seeing censorship, attempts in different areas. And so just to have this moment of visibility, this historical tract is really inspiring and empowering. And it truly is like a beautiful example of what queerness looks like in so many different communities, in so many different ways. And it makes me so happy to see these queer Latino men from like the 60s and 70s, trans women from, way back when, and just communities that have existed. And I don't know, it makes my little heart beat harder. It's
I will meet you at the Getty for that one. That sounds incredible. And Alex Cooper, any stories of queer joy that you want to shout out?
Yes, there's a queer robot in West Hollywood that's walking around, and that just brings me a lot of joy. I just love it. And if you see photos of it, I highly recommend looking it up, because it's outrageous and Megan has some competition. Let's just say that.
I'm going to check that out. I don't know if that's a real thing or someone that I dated, but that's very exciting. Very exciting. Finally, folks, Andrea Gibson, the venerated poet and performance artist who touched so many lives with their words that just unabashedly explored gender, identity, politics, and connection, sadly died last week. There was an outpouring of individuals whose work Gibson inspired, and really, holy crap, will Andrea be missed, even as their words most certainly live on. Would love to get from you all real quick. I love seeing people sharing like how much they loved Andrea Gibson and also shouting out other writers who have influenced their work. So the question for this week is, give me an LGBTQ plus writer who has really influenced your work. We'll start with you, Alex Cooper.
On a personal note, this is really hard because I read so much nonfiction that I was just like, what can we do? And for right now, though, because of Gibson's passing, I've been reading a lot of their work. And so they're influencing me still. Like, I was a new follower of theirs. Like, I just started following them weeks before their death. But just being exposed to their work and their poetry has been, it's been a gift.
Amazing. Dani Kington, tell us a writer.
Well, Matilda Bernstein Sycamore is a trans fiction writer, editor, and essayist whose work I've followed for a number of years. I really just stumbled upon the first book of hers that I read when I forgot to bring a book with me traveling and picked up a random book in a bookstore, and it was hers. And it came to me at a really, particular moment in life where I was just at the beginning of investigating my transness, and her depiction of a young trans person seeking community through her book Sketch to See was just really inspiring for me personally. And then her work has also continued to influence me as a fiction writer, especially. And by the way, to go back to Sullivan, she's been an activist around for decades who's been consistently anti-assimilationist the whole time.
Love that. Books find us when we need them to find us. Albert Serna Jr., give us a writer who's been influencing you.
I think forever, it has been Edmund White. I mean, his work truly was like an exploration of his own identity and experiences as he was coming out. I mean, he wrote some really beautiful novels that were semi-autobiographical. He wrote The Joy of Gay Sex, or worked on it with, a partner. And so his writing has been truly profound, and he passed away not too long ago. But I think for me, growing up as a young queer person, picking up some of his books and hiding it in secret, and reading it truly inspired me in the way that I look at how I examine myself and how I am as a writer.
All incredible writers. Well, we certainly want to hear what you all are working on. Dani Kington, what are you cooking up there at the Athens County Independent?
Well, I'm continuing to follow up on Ohio University's response to the so-called Advanced Ohio Education Act, how they're handling sort of the aftermath of that, what happened to the people who worked at these centers, are there threats to curriculum, and so on. So that's one piece I'm working on. I'm also writing a story about impacts on Planned Parenthood, specifically thinking about the rural Southeast Ohio context and what the ramifications are of what's happened in other parts of the state.
Alex Cooper, what's coming up at The Advocate? What isn't coming up at The Advocate?
I was like, that's a question. We are putting the last finishing touches on our next print issue this week.
Always excited when that comes in the mail. And Albert, what can we look forward to from you?
Yeah, so LACIJ is currently looking at the impact of immigration in the San Gabriel Valley, which is just outside of Los Angeles. So we're looking at how cities and communities and stakeholders and people in power are addressing these issues and what can be done to either ensure people are safe or how to work with the communities to foster education. So keep an eye out on that series that we're working on.
We will certainly keep an eye out. Well, I want to thank this week's roundtable, Alex Cooper from The Advocate, Albert Serna Jr. from the Los Angeles Center for Investigative Journalism, and Dani Kington from the Athens County Independent. Thanks to all of you for participating this week.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
I'm Ken Schneck, editor of the Buckeye Flame, and that's all we have time for this week. If you liked this episode of This News is So Gay, please share it with a friend and subscribe so that you do not miss out on our next episode. In the meantime, read LGBTQ+ news, share the stories of LGBTQ+ reporters, and support the work of LGBTQ+ newsrooms. Until next week, friends.